Today, I'm going to talk to you about American government. And to do that, we kind of have to go back to the beginning to kind of see where we were when we first started this whole experiment to kind of how we are today. Um, in the early days, I mean, way back in the day, there was this belief that America was under what we call American exceptionalism. And that has meant all sorts of things throughout history, sometimes depending on your political aspirations and your political mindset. Some people have taken it to mean America's better than other countries. Others have taken it to go the complete opposite and say it shows the problems in the American civilization, as in colonization and all sorts of other things that we've done over the years. Well, let's kind of take a step back from that and kind of look at where we were back then and how we got to where we are today. Because if we want to understand politics and American government today, you kind of have to understand how we got here. We didn't just grow up today or grow up like yesterday and suddenly become this nation that we are. We didn't do this because we were constantly on this path to get to some specific um, end goal that some people would like to believe we've achieved. Instead, it's just a continued, evolution or growth or whatever you want to call it, that has got us from the early days of basically one or a few people control to more of a communal government, to sometimes losing that and kind of going back to that one or a few person control again. A lot of it has to do with all sorts of different reasons as to why we get there from there, such as, we during the 9/11 situation, we gave up a lot of our freedoms in order to gain security. And so, much like if you look at Benjamin Franklin, who talks about, when you give up your freedom for your security, sometimes you end up losing your security and your freedom at the same time. So those are kind of important things to think about. But the roots of the American government go back into like the early days of putting together the ideas of why people do the things that they actually do, or why people interact with each other, how they communicate with each other. One of our first thinkers, at least in the Western canon, is a man named Aristotle. And his process was to look at basically everything by removing himself from the actual, being part of it, and looking at some of the foundations of where we got there and how we could actually use the information that we have available to us to kind of make ourselves stronger. So over, thousand or several thousand years, we've drawn on that information and quite often kept going back to it because some of the original ideas were really, really good. Part of the problem with that is when something gets taught in canon for, you know, hundreds and thousands of years, people tend to believe it must be that way because that's the way we've always been teaching it. Tradition has a really bad habit of becoming dogma. And I don't mean the religious aspect of it, but I mean dogma as in everyone believes it because everyone's always believed it. And so it becomes very hard to come up with new ideas because people are so tied into the ideas that they learned a long time ago and have been taught by their parents and their parents, and they've been teaching their kids kind of going forward. So it's hard to break from some of those habits. But some of the things that did happen literally happened a couple of hundred years ago. And basically the concept that's important for us to focus on is social contract theories, which is no longer this, one person's in charge and one person is in charge because God told this person to be in charge, but because it's the right person based on the circumstances of the people around that person. So in the beginning, there was a religious aspect to it, so like a deity appointed someone to be what they were, then that slowly evolved and changed into a different process to where people became the instruments and elements that gave the sovereign the power. So if you look at some of the early thinkers or middle thinkers, I guess is how you would call it, like Thomas Hobbes, who argued, the idea of the state of nature and basically a place you want to escape from, get to a place that's of safety, and that place of safety is designed around an institution where somebody's in charge and protecting you. And so that person uses all of the resources that are available in order to continue protecting you. At least that's how the theory would work. Then you kind of add offshoots to that, which is John Locke, which is kind of a little the same thing. There's still a religious aspect to it, but there's more of a property value to it, such as the protection of people and property. So it becomes part of it. So you're no longer just doing it for the right reasons, such as a higher power telling you to do it, but you're doing it for other kind of aspects that you can, tangible aspects that you can use to protect you and to make your life better. And then we kind of evolve a little bit further beyond that to a more socialistic aspect, which is Rousseau, who gives the idea that it's more of a contractual thing amongst people as to why they get along and do the things that they do. And so they can get a lot more accomplished by being part of a group than being part of just the social aspect or the central aspect itself. Part of one of the little interesting sidebars on Rousseau, because often he's referred to as a socialist by people who don't really understand a lot about him, is he also argued at one point that democracy is a really good thing, but part of the problem with democracy is we're only a democracy when we vote. And so when we're no longer voting, we become basically whatever, oligarchy or monarchy or whatever it is that we establish after the voting is done. So something to kind of keep in mind, because that's never really changed. That's still kind of the way process works today. So we ended up with two different kinds of democracies going forward. I mean, there's all sorts of different governments. You've got monarchies, you've got democracies, you've got theocracies. I mean, so many ocracies that are actually out there that the one we're going to be focused mostly in for the United States is democracy, because that's generally what we are. And depending on your interpretations of the word democracy, you can have all sorts of really weird understandings of it. I mean, on the definitions alone, it can be argued that China is a democracy. It's just a different kind of a democracy. I won't get into the finer details of that, but for the kind of democracies we're talking about here are direct and indirect democracies. So direct democracy means you're voting for pretty much everything. And so, and a good example of that is Athenian democracy. We use a lot of the concepts that they did back then. How they actually got their people into office is another story. Like when John Adams actually helped come up with the ideas of creating the electoral institutions in the United States, he bothered to kind of miss that the Athenians actually liked lottery as their way of actually choosing people to become their officers or their elected officials. We kind of forgot that, and then decided, or I think surreptitiously forgot that, and then decided, okay, we're just going to do it this way. And because nobody knew better, at least until many years later, at least until people started studying it, people just assumed that's the way voting was supposed to be, or the way democracy was supposed to be done in the first place. So we've stuck to a more voting aspect of democracy. Then you have indirect democracy, which is people get voted into office or put into office, and then they become the representatives of the particular people who they're supposed to be representing. So a good example of that is like the Roman system, which was you had senators and leaders of government who represented the people, but the people didn't actually vote for them unless the people were in power themselves. And so you had to be like of the higher elite to work to actually vote. So we have a little bit of that kind of going on, and our system has decided to institute all sorts of mixtures of that, such as we have senators and representatives who basically are the indirect democracy in the United States, but to become that, they were put in through direct democracy because the people voted for them. Well, if you look at the original senators, that wasn't the way it was. Matter of fact, most of them were appointed by the state governments or governors. And so, again, not direct democracy, but slowly it's evolved over time to where people felt we should have more of a say-so in kind of what's going on today. So we have kind of mixtures and dualities throughout our whole system to kind of make that sort of system work. Now, one of the interesting sidebars to the way our system works is we have a very strong capitalist society, which means, you know, free market or somewhat free market. There are some constraints from government, which you kind of have, or you're going to have basically mercantilism, you know, run amok. We don't really have too many mercantile systems out there. A couple of countries in the Middle East these days, and Denmark, some years back, a little bit still these days. So, I mean, you're not getting a whole lot of that because basically capitalism is taking over a lot of those processes. So you've got capitalism competing with communism and socialism and a couple of other institutions that are kind of working pretty much around the world. Communism is still out there. There's about 3 or 4 major countries that are still underneath those umbrellas. At one point, there really wasn't a whole lot of countries and a whole lot of people under those institutions. But when you've got countries like China that basically have, you know, well over 1 billion people, that's a huge chunk when it's about 1/6 of the entire planet. So the numbers we're talking about are pretty high, even if the numbers of countries aren't. So do keep that in mind when we're talking about different kinds of governments and economic systems. And also understanding that economic systems are not the same thing as governments. People have a tendency to mix the two of them together, and sometimes we'll call a communist governmental system their economic system, or their economic system being communism or socialism, and calling that their government system, when in fact their government can be something completely different, like a democracy or totalitarianism, based on whatever their actual government functions actually are. So important things to understand. People sometimes take the easy way out and just don't really force themselves to think all the way through this whole thing. So one of the concepts that we have in the United States that's really important is what we have is called popular consent. So this is the power from the consent of the governed, which means all the people in government, I keep saying that means, our people in government got their power because we decided they're the ones that actually should go there and do it, and then they represent us going forward. That doesn't suddenly make them kings or emperors, although we have had some that think they are once they get that position. Do remember they're elected, and they can also be removed. Sometimes we end up with leaders that are so self-conscious, self-righteous, not conscious, that they sometimes forget that. And when they do get removed, they pretty much get dragged out kicking and screaming. Nobody likes to be removed from office. We also have what's called popular sovereignty, which is the right of the majority to govern themselves. This is a kind of a twisted one, and it's also a controversial one, because sometimes people will fight for their right to govern themselves, and it goes against the people who are actually in power that don't want to give up that power. And then you end up with all sorts of, well, revolutions, social revolutions, and all that. One of the other concepts, in at least in the United States and a lot of the Western countries, is majority rule. A lot of people don't understand that. They make the mistake of calling it 51% is majority rule, whereas it's 50% plus one vote, because you only need that one vote in order to make majority rule. And there's an old concept that goes back to almost to the days of the early days of the republic, our republic, called the totalitarian, totalitarian rule. So basically, the idea is, or tyranny of the majority, which is when you have just that 50% plus one person, which is not 51% of the country. It's, could be 50.00001%, but because they rule and decide they want to do something, it could take away the rights for all of the other people, which could be about half the country. And when you have a country that's divided down the middle, like we are these days, we have been for quite some time, it can create all sorts of problems. So almost every 4 years, you're going to have major divisions throughout the country that may not go away after a specific election. That's, again, where we're kind of running into these days. So let's talk about political scientists, because political scientists focus mostly on demographics rather than on the specific politics of the issues themselves. While in the background that they are focusing on those things, the majority of the time the way they do this is by focusing on demographics. And people often wonder, why do they do that? And part of the reason for that is people are, political scientists are trying to figure out trends and why things actually happen. And you can't do it just from guessing. And historically, that's how bad science has been generated in this country, is we tend to just go with I think or I believe or any of those types of statements, whereas demographics looks at certain percentages, finds out how many people actually think this, and then takes those numbers and determines it's the majority likes this and the majority doesn't like this, as opposed to I think this because all of my friends think this. Because we have a concept called anecdotal evidence, which basically means I heard a bunch of stuff around me, so therefore everyone else thinks that. You don't know everybody. And as there are, hundreds of millions of people in this country, just in this country alone, you can't come up with determinations like that without quite often being wrong, which we have been historically, which is why political scientists focus mostly on the idea of demographics, such as how many people live here, how many members of this particular ethnic group live here. Sorry, my throat's kind of going bad. So when we study a lot of the trends that have happened over elections, we usually look at, parties to see, what side people actually voted for. Our country has been a two-party system since pretty much its beginning. Sometimes those two systems have changed quite a bit to where, in some cases, some of the issues, the same exact people, if they lived today, from 150 years ago, would be in the complete opposite party, just because the people of those areas really haven't changed that much in what they thought, but the party affiliations and what the parties stand for have. So there's a lot of that. We'll get into a lot of that as we kind of go through the rest of this class going forward. So there's been a lot of changes over the years. If you look at some of the demographics and if you look at some of the PowerPoints that I actually have that are part of this course, you will see that the different changes over the years have really been instrumental, but they've been gradual. And so it hasn't been a whole lot of, abrupt change for specific things unless something specific happened, like World War II or World War I or the Spanish-American War. Wars often have tendencies to change quite a few things. The Spanish-American War, the 9/11 attacks, stuff like that. So these kinds of things can cause a whole bunch of people to think differently than they normally have thought before. So one of the things we will also focus on in this class is political ideology. And the problem with understanding political ideology is people get tied into this, those guys and us guys, or us, not guys, but those people and us people, that sort of thing. And so this us versus them sort of thing that we have going on in this country. And we do that because it's short. It's a short-term or easy aspect, a almost a meme-driven process in order to solve situations without actually solving anything. So if I want to, find out who all believe in one particular thing or who all agree with me on a specific thing, political ideology quite often helps me figure out who all believes this certain thing, because over the years we start to find out, conservatives all believe one thing, liberals all believe one thing, libertarians believe one specific thing. But the reality is they don't. There are all sorts of cross applications, even from state to state. A state conservative in Texas is not the same thing as a state conservative in New York. So, I mean, just because they're both conservatives don't mean they believe in the exact same things. Some things they do, some things they don't. Some may be for or against gun control. Some may be for or against abortion or whatever other issue is tied into it. Sometimes those delineations don't stand across, all sorts of different, areas and cross applications and different Venn diagrams that kind of get pushed across through the system. So here's some of the problems with political science today and it's not just political science, it's on politics. People have a very high, strong concept of what they should get from government. The problem is they don't often know what they want, nor do they know how much have they actually received in the first place. They just know that quite often they don't like what they're getting right now, so they look at the whole system as bad, and therefore it's got to get better. And so it makes it very easy for some really bad people, or bad is probably not the word for it, thinkers who are capable of capitalizing on the mistrust of the system by people. These are the kinds of people that are easily swayed. And I don't mean that they're not smart or anything, but I mean, if they're not happy with the system, they're going to be looking for something that's different. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be better. And because of that, they may just jump onto some other bandwagon that they hadn't thought of before, just because it's there and it's actually available. And sometimes they think it's better than what they've had before or what they've been following before. One of the other problems we have is kind of the opposite approach to that, which is there's a whole mistrust of politicians. Over the years, people have generally not trusted politicians, and that's because of some of the bad politicians that have actually been part of the system. And so in order to become a solid politician that's successful, is usually you have to promise quite a few things, and when you do, you quite often don't deliver on everything you promised. So you're going to have people who always remember the things you didn't deliver on. And so they're not going to trust you further. And the more distrust they have of specific politicians, the more distrust we've ended up with politicians in general. So if you have 5 politicians running, there's probably, of the 10 people paying attention to them, 8 of them distrust 4 or 5 of those politicians, which means there's a lot of distrust of politicians going through, if that makes any sense. One of the other problems we have in this country is called voter apathy. not a whole lot of people are voting. And there's all sorts of reasons for it, and I won't get into it right here, but we'll get into it later on. And because of that, people tend to bow out of the system, which causes the people who are part of the system and really, really paying attention to it and wanting to change it, you know, have more power than the people who basically don't do anything, because the people who aren't doing anything aren't voting and therefore have been removed as a potential aspect of getting something done. So that's kind of the end of where we are with the first chapter. And so keep that in mind as we're going forward. I just kind of want to give you a start, and make sure you're reading the text as we go through it, because it's helpful to kind of understand exactly what we're talking about.